Ungor, mag ik u uitnodigen op het podium te komen om de laudatio te houden.
Excellencies, honored guests, students, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. On the 6th of April 1994, the airplane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down during landing in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. The assassination triggered a policy of mass murder of Tutsis and moderate Hutus, which lasted for 3 months and destroyed about 800,000 people, which became known as the Rwandan genocide. The killing was conducted by elite troops, special militias, and ordinary citizens. And the victims ranged from uneducated peasants to university professors, from the eldest in society to the newly born, and indeed even the unborn. The genocide devastated the country and only came to an end when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, under the current President Paul Kagame, conquered Rwanda in July 1994 and ousted the Habyarimana regime. Today we honor Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire, who witnessed the genocide from before the beginning to after the end. Night after night, from his headquarters in Kigali, perched on top of a hill, Dallaire would hear the sound of the wind carrying the voices and screams of men, women, and children being slaughtered. Ever since the genocide, Dallaire has been active in politics, humanitarianism, and research. He was a senator in Canada, a public lecturer, and I can say as a university lecturer that he's also an excellent researcher and a patient writer. His 2 books are Shake Hands with the Devil, 2007, and They Fight Like Soldiers, They Die Like Children, 2010. Both books have won numerous awards, and he has 2 books forthcoming. He's a compelling writer, and those chapters in his first book that don't deal with the genocide are just as captivating as those that do. But arguably, the most poignant thing General Dallaire has ever wrote was 3 months before the Rwandan genocide began. He had received credible information that extremist groups within the Rwandan government were stockpiling weapons and preparing for massacres. So he sent a cable to the United Nations in New York, warning them and asking permission to take action. And he signed this telegram with the now legendary words, "Peu ce que veut, allons-y." So where there's a will, there's a way, let's go. But the United Nations rebuffed his request and left him and the Rwandan people in the lurch. And I can say that this insight does not follow from the luxury of hindsight. The first time I met General Dallaire was during a genocide conference in Montreal in October 2007, where he was a speaker. I had brought my copy of Shake Hands with the Devil. I gathered my courage, stepped up to him in the corridor, and asked him to sign my book. And I remember he extended his palm, and he shook my hand. And my hand simply disappeared into his huge hand. And for a moment, I just kind of stared at his knuckles, mesmerized by the size and the gravitas of this hand. So not only had these hands seen a lot, but I also thought, I guess we'll never know, but if the devil also wrote a book about shaking Dallaire's hand, I'm sure he would have been impressed too. During this conference, there was a particularly telling moment when during the main panel discussion, a Rwandan genocide survivor, Esther Mujawayo, a very brave woman, she stood on the stage to speak, and her microphone malfunctioned. And so nobody could hear her in the large hall. And in moments like this, of course, there's a lot of confusion, there's indecision, who has to do what. And this lingered for an awkward moment when Dallaire simply got up, took off his own microphone and gave it to Mrs. Mujawayo, to a standing ovation. Now, I thought this was a very symbolic moment. Dallaire had literally given a voice to a survivor. To many people, Roméo Dallaire represents the ideal of doing what is right with humility. And humility is key. Canadians don't like people who seek attention for themselves, and indeed neither do the Dutch. I can also say, and I'm proud to say, that there are indeed two Twentenaren on stage today, because Dallaire is from Denenkamp, as we just noticed, and I myself am from Enschede. I wanted to mention this little provincial pride because, in a way, he is our general too. Twentenaren, or tukkers, are generally characterized as modest, down-to-earth, hands-on, no-nonsense, and with a healthy skepticism to authority. In Twents dialect, we would say, doe maar normaal, jong, which translates to, just be yourself, kid. But of course, I will not give the rest of my talk in Twents dialect. What makes Dallaire remarkable is not just the way that what he experienced in Rwanda, but more about how he has chosen to use his personal experience to fight for the prevention of genocide, the abolition of the use of child soldiers, and the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder. This struggle is undoubtedly lonely, and it is born from personal trauma, making it all the more courageous. In a way, Dallaire's life is a monument to the modern history of genocide, which we study at the Nooit. Born 2 years after Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide, and 2 years before the signing of the United Nations Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, Dallaire stands in the tradition of men such as Armin Wegner, the German humanitarian and author who was stationed in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. He witnessed the Armenian genocide, and he took the only photographs that we have right now of that genocide, documenting the destruction of the Armenians. Or, of course, Raoul Wallenberg, and many other heroes on which the Nooit has recently published a book with the title Heroes, Helden. Consequently, he has rightly received many decorations, including 5 acronyms behind his name. I won't even begin to list them. A dozen honorary doctorates. He was featured in films, documentaries, and even songs, including, of course, my personal favorite genre, Canadian folk music. There are schools and streets named after him in Canada and in Ghana. And even though we have a Raphael Lemkin Street here in Amsterdam, we have not yet honored any street after Roméo Dallaire in his native Netherlands. But his impact is certainly global. A colleague of mine was working with victims of political violence in Burundi in 2007 when he befriended a certain Diomed. This was a Tutsi man who worked for an anti-torture NGO. And one day, when visiting Diomed in his home, he learned that his son was named Dallaire. So he said that he named him, so this is the kid's first name, Dallaire. He named him because, and I quote, "Dallaire is a brave man. He tried to save us even when nobody else was listening." End of quote. So father and son have since moved to Canada because of ongoing political violence in Burundi. Roméo Dallaire is a moral voice on many levels. I will identify here only 3. First of all, interventionism. During and since the Rwandan genocide, Dallaire's position on humanitarian interventionism is a fearless, post-colonial, institutionalist, and robust approach to confronting massacres and genocides. The lack of effective humanitarian intervention is often ascribed to a lack of political will by influential states or deadlocks in international relations between the great powers. And indeed, Dallaire's experiences in Rwanda, they really epitomize the United Nations' failure to confront genocide. And in this documentary, the CBC documentary, Shake Hands with the Devil, when Dallaire returns to Rwanda, he's not even granted permission to enter the UN compound which he held in 1994 for quite a while. So these are truly Kafkaesque dimensions. The lessons of his experience are wide-ranging. Last week, and again yesterday, I spoke to a well-educated young Syrian refugee here in Amsterdam. This is a young man from the Damascus suburb of Douma, and his father and his uncle were killed by bombings, by barrel bombs, and he himself was arrested twice, and he was tortured first 3 weeks and then another week by 2 different security agencies. And so he asked me, since you're a professor, why isn't the world doing anything to stop Assad's murderous campaigns against the Syrians? And so I asked him back, have you ever heard of the country Rwanda? And he said no. So I gave him a copy of Dallaire's book, and he is currently reading it now. The second issue is racism. So, of course, as an immigrant and as a francophone, Dallaire had had encounters with ethnic and cultural difference before he was deployed in Rwanda. There, in Rwanda, he saw the consequences of one of the worst instances of African racism, the Hutu racist extremism against Tutsis. And the Rwandan genocide became an ugly template, a nadir for the racism underlying the Western-dominated state system. That we didn't intervene simply because we do not identify with those people. So too in the media, the genocide quickly became a footnote in history, to quote an influential and infamous French politician. Anonymous Rwandan masses were abandoned to the benefit of individual European lives. Dallaire, on the other hand, living in very, very close intimacy with Rwandans, dealt with people in the most unprejudiced, sensitive, humanizing way possible. And many Rwandans remember him for this. Third, leadership. Dallaire once wrote in an essay, and I quote, "Canada's institutions, schools, technology, values, work ethic, belief in humanity, in human rights, make it capable of a leadership role in advancing human rights. This country has a responsibility as a mature nation, but we are kowtowing to other powers, fiddling in the margins, and we're not committing ourselves. What will they say about Canada 50 years from now?" End of quote. Now, these words ring just as true for the European politicians who tolerated years of incredible violence in their backyards, not only in Yugoslavia, but also in Chechnya, and currently in Iraq and Syria. Leadership did not just consist of words either. Dallaire actively made an effort to take the initiative and act. He and his staff often relied on their UN credentials to save Tutsis, heading off inter-Rahmwe attacks even while being outnumbered and outgunned. And as a result, his actions are credited with directly saving the lives of over 30,000 people. So just to put this in perspective, Oskar Schindler rescued approximately 1,200 human beings. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no dignity in war and genocide. There's no dignity in victimization, there's no dignity in perpetration, and there's no dignity in standing by. Therefore, it is the more moving to witness Roméo Dallaire's dignified response to genocide and its aftermath. A towering giant, physically and morally, with a unique sense of resolve, compassion, and an unrelenting commitment to justice. His trials and tribulations, legacies and lessons are just as relevant now as they were on the day that the Rwandan genocide ended in the summer of 1994. As the United Nations again are failing to stop the mass murders in Syria, as child perpetrators are committing atrocities in Iraq, we must carry on the message that Dallaire has spread ever since Rwanda. Peu ce que veut, allons-y. Thank you.
Excellencies, former Prime Ministers, ambassadors, general officers, members of the Netherlands Auschwitz Society, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for braving unfavorable weather to come this afternoon to listen to an old soldier. I am most grateful for the Mayor of Denenkamp to have come forward and presented me with the plaque. And as I was talking with him before the event, I said I was recently in York, where beside the cathedral, there is a huge statue of Emperor Constantine, who, while he was commanding in that region, was told that he had become the Emperor of Rome, and he had to fight, of course, two others to actually acquire it. But they got a great statue of him sitting there in a very general officer way in a fine-looking chair. And so I asked the mayor, should ever you need someone to provide a few dollars, I wouldn't mind. I will be very humbly happy to just put a plaque in the entrance of the old hospital where I was born and to assist in its foundation. For I have returned there a number of times, and returned with my mother, who was probably the bravest of them all, to marry this very huge Canadian soldier and to go across the seas on a Red Cross ship in the winter of 1946 with a 6-month-old baby in a basket, to arrive in Halifax to be processed and put on a Red Cross train, and to arrive in Quebec City in the middle of a snowstorm, hoping that that same sergeant would still be there and sober to recognize her and his son and to accept us in that still very young country. And so although she passed away a few years ago at 93, her love for him and commitment to Canada and to the children that she raised was exemplary. An exemplary of the courage and the fortitude and the strength of character of the Dutch nation, for which I am exceptionally proud to have at least 50% of that influence in me. And I am all the more proud to be able to say that I have a cousin here today with me, and also to say that I am most thankful of being given the opportunity to speak of a subject that is not just history, but is reality. And it is a reality of today, and as we continue to stumble through this very complex and ambiguous era that started particularly by the end of the Cold War, we are seeing that the threats and the difficulties of advancing human rights, of protecting gender, of protecting the populations at risk, of preventing children being turned into weapons of war, continues not to be abated, but on the contrary, continues to grow. As last year was the year where there were the most child soldiers used in the history of humanity in conflicts. And so, being able to speak to you this afternoon on a subject that I consider to be the focus of my life for the last while and into the future, and hopefully the institute that I created is going to continue after I'm not there, I am forever thankful to be able to do it at a platform and for a society that has been martyred in the past and is always fearful, and rightly so, of being targeted in the present and the future. And that we should be most conscious of the vulnerability of human beings from different groups, be they religious, ethnic, tribal, or simply groups of people who have power and those who don't have power. So what of this era? And where are our sort of start points in this era? Well, I was asked to produce a paper which will be published, in which I concentrate significant amount of effort in the subject of genocide prevention, and I use both Rwanda and Darfur, where there are still over 2 million people in horrible scenarios, as a tool to explain that we have not gotten yet into the mindset, into the skill set of being able to even resolve many of the conflicts, for we are still doing a lot of ad hoc, a lot of on-job training, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of crisis management in places like Afghanistan and in places certainly like Syria, and what we did even in Libya, and what is going on in Burundi, and the festering scenarios that we see now in South Sudan and even in the DRC. That as we see this continuum there is a fundamental premise that seems to be lost by us in trying to at least recognize these vulnerabilities, but also recognize these incredible responsibilities that we of the 20% of the haves of the world have towards the 80% of the have-nots of the world. We pretentiously say that humanity is advancing because soon we'll be able to land somebody on Mars. Yet as we are doing that and moving extraordinarily with technology in certain domains, we're leaving behind 80% of humanity. How can we pretentiously say that humanity is advancing when the vast majority is regressing and is still dying and suffering in the mud, in the blood, and the absence of any hope? And so I argue to start that all humans are not seemingly being treated as human. That is to say that maybe all humans are not human. Maybe there are some humans who are more human than others. Some count more than others. An anecdote I use in this sort of element of commencing or establishing the parameters of my paper is during the genocide. At one point, the warring factions, remember you've got a civil war, plus you've got the killing behind the lines. And the warring factions have decided to pull apart, to regroup. And so they create between them a vacuum, which in military terms we call no man's land. But I suppose, to be politically correct, I should say no person's land. And my job at that point was to go between the lines, to negotiate with each of the powers, to be able to move people of their ethnicity behind their own lines. For so many were caught behind the lines of the other. So I'm going down the road to this meeting, and up ahead, about 200 meters, there's a little boy, about 6 or 7 years old, in the middle of the road. What the extremists were doing in order to sustain the conflict and the killing is they would use young children and they would put them on the roads where they knew humanitarian convoys would be coming through. And they'd tell the children to stay there on the road to stop, of course, the convoy. And if the children didn't stay there, I'm talking children of 5 and 6 and 7 years old, that young. If the children did not stay there, they simply slaughtered them and put others. And so expecting an ambush slowed down, and I had a couple soldiers with me. We jumped out of our vehicles. There was no ambush. There shouldn't have been the child. There should be nobody. And so we immediately went along the road to the huts to see if there was anybody there to take care of this child. And all we found were bodies of people who had been killed weeks before. But as we were doing that, we lost the child. So we doubled back and we found him in a hut where there was 2 adults, a male, female, and 2 children. But they were half eaten by dogs and rats, and he was sitting there as if he was at home. And so I picked him up and I brought him in front of my vehicle and I looked at him. His stomach was bloated, he was all dirty, mangy, he was in rags, flies all around him. But then I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in the eyes of that little 7-year-old boy caught up in the maelstrom of that civil war and that genocide was exactly what I saw in the eyes of my 7-year-old son that I had left in Quebec City when I went off to Africa. They were the eyes of a human child, and they were exactly the same. That little boy was just as human as my son back home. And yet, the international community, in its assessment of that conflict in the first week, many of the big powers came through to do a reconnaissance. And I would insist they debrief me before they left. And to every one of them, I asked what they were going to do to help reinforce my mission in order to stop the killing. And to every one of them, I had to recognize that they had absolutely no interest in coming because there was nothing there. There was nothing in Rwanda. There was no strategic resources of oil or whatever. It wasn't in a strategic location. The only thing that was there were humans. And one, as the film said, actually said, and there are too many of them anyways, it's overpopulated. The only thing that was there are humans, and it did not carry the day. And so, over the last 25 years of stumbling through this new era, we have established by our actions and by our inactions a pecking order in humanity. As I could barely keep 450 soldiers in Rwanda, where there were more people killed, injured, internally displaced, refugeed, and raped in 100 days than the 6 years of the Yugoslavian campaign, ex-Yugoslavia got 67,000 troops. What were the criteria used by the political elites of the developed world in deciding to put the assets only in Yugoslavia and to abandon totally the Rwandans? And if the criteria that they used at that time still exist, can they actually say that they're coming from countries that believe in human rights, that believe that all humans are human? Can they actually stand in front of their own nations and say that they are taking decisions that are worthy of them and of their nation and of their history, and worthy of the responsibility to humanity, not only to their nation? Or are they just a bunch of political hypocrites? And so, some of us have dabbled over the last while in politics. When I retired after 36 years in the Army, I was involved in war-affected children and was in the war in Sierra Leone, extracting children, and I did my research on child soldiers because the realization I had was the bulk of the killing that was done in Rwanda was done by youths, was done by young people, dynamic, young people before the social media, who were grouped together as the youth wing of a political party, who slowly and very deliberately gave them power, gave them influence, gave them an idea that there was another group that was inferior, that there was a group that they should fear, and continued to indoctrinate them, but at the same time train them under the premise that it was defensive, to help defend in case. And turn that youth group called Interamwe into a militia. And it was that militia, not with sophisticated high-tech weapons, but with machetes, where China had delivered a month and a half before the genocide 160,000 brand new machetes. And nobody really wanted to say or claim them, yet they were there and they ultimately got distributed. Those young people were turned into the killing machines that essentially slaughtered the 800,000. Not by bullets, not by sophisticated armies, not by professional armies, not by professional killers, but by youth, children. Children turned in to do the dirty work of warped adults who conducted the genocide not purely because of an ethnic demand, for the ethnicity was quite evident. It wasn't religious. They were of the same religion. They had gone to church. It was Easter. They had gone to church together, sang together. It was, yes, of a tribal background, but they had intermarried and had been working extensively. The essence of why the genocide happened was power. That those who were in power did not want to share power with that particular group whom they feared they would have to share power with and potentially maybe even be in a minority position. And ultimately, they sat deliberately just after signing the peace agreement and were trying to figure out, what are we going to do now that we've signed this peace agreement under duress? And they came up with the idea that why don't we just get rid of them? Why don't we just eliminate them? I mean, nobody really knows where Rwanda is. We are of no great consequence. We don't have any world position that countries are seeking. We receive massive amounts of aid. We don't have enough food even to feed our own because of some of the crops. So they won't even know what is happening. And they actually produced the plan. And they actually implemented the plan. And they slaughtered 2/3 of that number. And the only reason it stopped was because of the other group that was able to defeat their force on the ground, even though a world power, ex-colonial power of the region, tried to stop it. Tried, in fact, to help separate the country in two, in a sort of Tutsi land and Hutu land, and in so doing, keep their finger in the pie of the local region. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the paper you will receive or distributed is going to argue that the methodologies that we have been using as we stumbled through the 90s, in this revolutionary period where conflict has changed so significantly in nature. However, the victims have not changed. They're still the civilians. They're still the women. And now, because of the demographics of those countries, where often there's over 50% of the population under the age of 18, and some even 15, the children are now bearing the brunt of the destruction in those countries of humanity. And so, as I argue in the paper, that passive diplomatic methodologies, that using instruments of the past, of the Cold War, to try to bring warring factions together, those methods are failing us for we are seeing recruitment even in our own countries. They're failing those nations. The passive peacekeeping chapter 6 is dead. It is a non-existent capability. It was invented when nation states were going after nation states, and they came to an agreement and needed a referee with no red card, to simply monitor and assist and make sure people played by the rules. It was ineffective in imploding nations and failing states in civil wars where it was Rwandans killing Rwandans. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? How do you tell them apart? What are the instruments to keep them separate? What are the tools? And how many Rwandans do I kill to establish peace? Or how many Rwandans do I simply watch get slaughtered as I receive orders and countries give orders to their troops not to intervene, not to engage, and in fact, to withdraw. To withdraw. Now, withdraw is a military term. It's a polite term. Some simply say run away. They pulled out their forces in the face of the enemy, but in the face of massive abuses of human rights, of mass atrocities, and ultimately, by the end of the first week, with the representative of the International Red Cross and myself going through the convention, defined it as in the face of genocide. They pulled out and they abandoned the Rwandans, hoping that it will stop soon and then they can throw some cash at it and maybe people will forget it. And so in the face of this horrible scenario that was being played out in a country where human beings were not only the targets of the belligerents, but were the prize of the belligerents, the international community abandoned those who were to be the victims. The subtitle of my first book, Shake Hands with the Devil, is The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. And it is under two premises. The first one is Rwandans amongst themselves failed their sense of humanity. This 90% Catholic country, very practicing country. The Pope had been there the year before, who went to church and sang together and prayed together and took communion together. That same society turned on itself and slaughtered each other. And in that slaughtering, they continued to pursue an ambition that was imposed upon them by the political elite that sold them to the idea that without eliminating these people, you would never be safe. We would never have power, and that your future would be at risk. So you have a scenario in which the people of the right and the same country are destroying each other. And you get the world watching. So not only did Rwandans lose their sense of humanity to themselves, but the 192 other countries of the time also abandoned Rwanda. Every other country in the world abandoned the Rwandans. People knew what was happening, and people refused to give to the UN the assets that it needed in order to influence the situation by mandates and by resources, mostly military, in order to engage and ultimately attenuate and try to stop the genocide. For the attempts previous of trying to prevent it had gone nowhere. Before the genocide started, nobody listened. Oh, there would be a massacre. More than likely, Burundi had just gone up in smoke with a coup d'etat, so there'll be massacres. There were 50,000 bodies floating down the rivers. I had 300,000 Burundian refugees overnight in the south of Rwanda. So it was sort of in the warped perspective that we've established this pecking order of humanity. It was nearly expected that the solution might end up in massacres. Nearly expected. And so there was no way that anyone previous to the start of the war would even want to entertain the word genocide. Mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, we were learning out of Yugoslavia. Tribalism and local killings, yes, of course. But it was when it became genocide that really threw the international community, and where I shudder to say before you is one of the principles that we used, that we were building on, that we had been building on since World War II, that my father fought, my father-in-law fought, that your country suffered and was martyred through. The concept of never again was not working. The concept of never again was failing. And that we were actually seeing genocide. And in fact, it was because of the concept of never again that it took us nearly a week to finally realize that everything we were seeing was meeting the criteria, but we still had to reassess whether or not it was correct. And to what extent did the international community use that incredulity to not accept the fact that we were telling them there was a genocide going on? Why did it take 6 weeks of the genocide and close to 400, estimated 400,000 slaughtered, with bodies floating into Lake Victoria? Why did it take so long for the international community and the world powers to recognize that it was a genocide? It was blatant. So it's the failure of humanity, the rest of the world, who were getting the information, who decided not to be engaged, not to assist, not to provide the UN with any assets, and in so doing, not only did not provide that, but had the affront to blame the UN for the failure. For that's the greatest scapegoat. I mean, if the UN can't solve it, how can I? Knowing full well that the UN has no army, has no resources unless it's given by nations. And so I have been watching over the years the interplay that we see regarding the passive commitment, which I call the non-kinetic commitment to trying to resolve conflicts. And I am seeing that we are having next to zero results in preventing these conflicts and in fact wresting the initiative from the bad people and protecting the civilians. What is difficult to accept is that not only that nobody wanted to come, that Rwanda didn't count, that there was no self-interest. But what really, really hurt, what really created the difficulty was the phone call 3 weeks into the genocide, where by then the bulk of my forces had been pulled out by their national orders and by the UN acquiescing to it, I get a phone call late at night from no less than the Secretary General himself. And the Secretary General very, very stoically says, "General, I have information from an ex-colonial power that the extremists are going to come and they're going to wipe out your force as they feel that they have already enough momentum to actually achieve their aim of slaughtering 1.2 million people, and they just didn't want you as witnesses." And we knew that our positions were, in fact, being reconnaissanced, and also that some of the extremist forces were deploying. And so he said, the international community has by then killed 14 peacekeepers, and I had close to 100 injured. He said, the international community cannot accept more Blue Berets dying for a humanitarian mission. And so he said, you are ordered to withdraw. Now, in the Army, we do get some training. Some would call it indoctrination. But sometimes also, all that training tends to be overridden by inner elements, your values, your ethical framework, your moral sort of compass. And without thinking and responding simply to what was welling inside me, he finished speaking, and I said, "Mr. Secretary General, I refuse that order. We're not going." The gentleman obviously was not used to people telling him that directly, that they weren't going to listen to him. He repeated it, this time in a different tone. And he repeated it in French, knowing that I spoke French, which gave it just a little bit more emphasis, and permitted me to respond in the like-minded way in French and say, "We're not leaving." So he hung up, and about a few minutes later, his chief of staff called, and he said, "You realize, General, you just received a legal order that you're putting your troops at risk because you've received a legal order to withdraw." And I said, "I acknowledge that, and thank you very much," and I hung up on him. So, I refused the legal order because the order was immoral. The rest of the world were immoral by even suggesting that 450 peacekeepers who were there to protect, although they were still debating it in New York, but we were protecting those other 30,000 Rwandans, that those peacekeepers, their lives were more important than the 10,000 Rwandans being slaughtered every day. To come to me with that premise as a solution to that conflict is one of the most vulgar conversations I can ever imagine. Because the immorality of us abandoning those 30,000, one contingent had pulled out before getting orders, and 4,000 people were slaughtered in the hours, about 3 hours. So they were going to be part of the exercise. So I refused the legal order because it was immoral. But then, for me to do that as a general, that's my decision. However, I've got troops under command. And a commander is not allowed giving an illegal order to his troops, particularly in a circumstance where their lives are at risk. And so I went to my deputy commander, who was Ghanaian. And I said, "Henry, I have just refused the legal order, and it is that we're not leaving. And I said, Henry, you must decide whether you're going to follow me in this illegal adventure or you pull out. And this Ghanaian general said, General, we are not going to be defeated on this battlefield and let that slaughter continue, including those 30,000, because we ran. And so every contingent that I had, individually I met and asked them whether they would stay with me and volunteer against the orders, and they all stayed. So there was an ethical position that had to be taken. That is to say, ethically ask my troops if they wanted to stay, and if they did, that they knew that they were doing an illegal order. They were doing an illegal operation that was morally correct and potentially going to save lives. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves in this era of these moral and ethical and even legal dilemmas that we're stumbling into with every new conflict, from Liberia to Libya to even watching Tunisia sometimes, to Syria, Iraq, Myanmar. We are seeing these complex situations. And recreated here in Europe, you had Yugoslavia, and you now got, of course, Ukraine. The whole rhythm of conflict has shifted and changed from our classic use of force to sustain peace on a grand strategic scale. As I participated in the early 70s in southern Germany as part of NATO, where we had 2.5 million troops on this side, facing 4 million troops on the other side. And we all had uniforms, and we could all recognize each other. We knew what their ethos was. We knew what they would respond to. Well, from that sort of classic, nearly simplistic attrition warfare, if it ever happened, we stumbled into all these dilemmas, and the scale has increased. The ruthlessness has increased. We have spent massive amounts of money. We have spilled blood, and we have still not wrested the initiative from those who want to perpetuate these conflicts and continue to abuse the civilian populations. For it is now the civilian population that are taking the brunt of the wars, not the military. They're not there. When in 2005, I was sent to Darfur by my Prime Minister to look at what Canada could do to support the African Union troops, I was sent in to assess what actually was going on the ground by the Sudanese and their forces and what they were trying to achieve. It was a time when, in fact, we simply saw the civilian population being moved and attrited and raped and killed to maintain power and not to share resources. And so that festering scenario still exists today. We still have people dying there every day, and women being slaughtered and raped as they get firewood and trying to survive. We still see millions in refugee camps and internally displaced camps. As last summer, I was in Jordan in the Syrian camps, where they were overtly recruiting 13 and 12-year-olds to join the Free Syrian Army to fight. And this brings me to the ebbing part of my presentation. For really, the second dimension of it is the fact that the populations that are so engrossed in conflict, that we have not been able to prevent, that we are at times choosing or not to intervene, that we've created a new conceptual framework in the responsibility to protect concept in 2005 that says that sovereignty is no more an absolute, and that the human being individually is sovereign. And when there's massive abuses of human rights, we, the countries of the world, have a responsibility to go in and protect them. Even with all those tools, we are still seeing these massive displacements and abuses ongoing. And countries are suffering the side effects of that with no logical end in sight. And I would argue that that scenario has been exacerbated by the fact of a very deliberate decision by the international community, by the belligerents, by some nations still. There are still 7 nations that recruit children under 18 in their forces. There are over 50 belligerent forces that recruit children to do their fighting. There is not one conflict in the world today where the primary weapon system is based on a child, on children. From the front end of the killing and maiming through the logistics, the bivouacs and running the camps and the logistics, right through to being sex slaves and bushwives. And although we have spent a lot of money in bringing in international law, because it's a crime against humanity, we have established conventions and protocols. We've established means of reporting on these countries. We have not seen a reduction of the use of that effective weapon system. On the contrary, we've seen an increase. On the contrary, we have seen now children moved from being the sort of interamwe anti-Tutsi youth to now a totally indoctrinated young person from the age of 8 or 9, being prepared to fight when he's 13, when she's 13. We have seen the radicalization of the children to render them simply that much more dangerous, if not effective, in these conflicts. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the scenario is completely changed. Wars are now conducted by children. And those planes in Iraq and Syria blowing away a Toyota truck with 5 or 6 guys in the back are probably blowing away 5 or 6 kids under the age of 16, maybe even as young as 13. We have not found the solutions, and we are seeing the future of many nations being put at risk by the fact that by recruiting children to be the weapons of war, they are setting up a perpetuating scenario of those wars continuing from one generation to the other by using children. And so my aim is to ultimately eradicate not only the use of children as weapons of war, but to eradicate the thought of humans using, adults using children as an option to be a weapon of war. And we can achieve that. We can achieve that by engagement, by training, by advocacy, and by realigning the problem from not being a demobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration problem to which I am sure many of you have participated in investing billions and picking up the pieces afterwards, remembering that the ones that you're rehabilitating and reintegrating into their societies are the ones who survived. The attrition rate of child soldiers is exceptionally high. So you're just picking up the ones that are still barely alive. And in that case, you're also trying to solve not only a crime against humanity by maybe bringing some of them here to Den Haag, the leaders, but you're also witnessing a sin. A sin. Because the boys who are recruited in those societies are reaccepted back into their communities, and they go through a transition, and we help them with that. And we help the society try to accept them. It was this sort of residual warrior thing. But the girls, because they've been abused, are abandoned by their families, abandoned by their communities. And the girls probably have 1 or 2 children from the rapes that they have been going through, who are sick. And they continuously wander and are being abused. The sin is being borne by the girls. That even within their own communities, they have next to no chance of being reintegrated unless they're moved into other societal structures that are willing to accept with funds. And so, thank you very much for helping the ones who survived. But you have done absolutely nothing in reducing the interest nor the numbers of children being used as weapons of war. And where I come to you and what I leave to the society in writing is the concept that children in war used as weapons of war are not a social economic problem. The whole damn country is going up in smoke. It is a security problem. It is a threat. And we must find the ways to resolve this threat. We must find ways to prevent the recruitment through the education systems and introducing programs to advise them and to assist in that security. And secondly, we have got to retrain our militaries and our police to work with the NGOs and to be able to resolve the frictions that they see in the field without necessarily simply reverting to the current doctrines of all the armies in the world, that the children are simply another belligerent and you have the right to self-defense and you use kinetic force and you just kill them. I'm running out of time and I'm going to leave you with one anecdote. At why it is urgent and why I think we can resolve it, and I've tested it now in South Sudan. I have tested it in the Congo, in Colombia, in the drug wars, in Uganda, helping them with Kony and the Lord Resistance Army. I think we can resolve it by emphasizing that we can bridge the mariage, the communion between humanitarian and security forces by providing new skill sets to those militaries and to those police, to those contingents that are deployed, to one, never want to recruit children, and two, to be able to use new tactics, a new doctrine, just like we introduced the responsibility to protect, the introduction of a new doctrine in how to neutralize the use of children as weapons of war and eliminate that capacity from the warring factions. If the adults want to fight, that's one thing. But using children to fight is a totally different scenario. And my aim is to get them out. And I end with the fact that not only are the children taking enormous brunt of the casualties, but so are our own soldiers. I have a nephew who's a sergeant from your special forces who still thinks he's in Bosnia 25 years after. And essentially what I say, the example I use is I am in Quebec City and I'm in a shopping center, and this very smart-looking young man in his 30s comes up to me and introduces himself as Sergeant so-and-so from such and such infantry battalion. And I say, how many years have you been in the army? He said, 12. I said, how many missions have you done? He said, 5. 3 in Afghanistan. I said, did you meet with child soldiers? His demeanor started to waver. He said, yes. I said, what was your job in the battalion? He says, I was in the reconnaissance platoon. And I said, what was your job in the reconnaissance platoon? Those who go ahead and anticipate what will be coming. And he broke down. He broke down and crying, and he was on his knees in the middle of this shopping center. And I took him aside, and after about 10 minutes of incoherent reactions, he finally was explaining to me that he had been back from Afghanistan for over 2.5 years, and he had still not been able to hug his young children because of the scale of slaughter that he had to conduct in destroying children in Afghanistan who were being used as weapons of war. Ladies and gentlemen, there are solutions. They are of intervention and engagement and of introducing new capabilities in this revolutionary era where the civilian population is both the target and the prize, but the primary weapon system that has started just over 25 years ago in Mozambique, the primary weapon system that is sustaining these conflicts and will perpetuate them, is the fact that we're letting them get away by using children as weapons of war. Thank you very much. If you put a microphone in front of a general, you're in for a long time. I like to end my statements in my country and in the States by the following. I don't think there's a more significant time to serve in uniform than now, because the missions are complex, but they are just, and ultimately, if we can succeed. But those who serve in uniform ask 2 things of their fellow citizens. 1, when you send them in, have the same strength of intestinal strength to sustain the operation until you succeed, and give them the tools to succeed. And don't pull out when it's politically cute when you spilt blood. And 2, when they come back in body bags and injured, that we treat them and their families with respect, with dignity, and they don't have to fight again to live decently as injured veterans in your own country.
Okay, thank you. Before war,
Very nice.
I'd like, thank this very much for the kind of
I shall give these to my country.